Hello, Ben Shute here, live from the OBU Violin Studio. Today I just wanted to share a few thoughts on the Brahms Sonatensatz, which just means sonata movement, and the sonata of which it's a movement is the so-called FAE sonata, FAE standing for Frei aber einsam. It's a German phrase meaning free but lonely, and it was a phrase by which Brahms and his friend, the great violinist Joseph Joachim, lamented in romantic fashion, lamented their singleness. Joachim would later marry, Brahms never did. But on Joachim's 21st birthday, Brahms teamed up with Schumann and a student of Schumann named Albert Dietrich to jointly compose this FAE sonata for Joachim. Dietrich took the first movement, Schumann did the second and fourth, and Brahms did the scherzo, which is this Sonatensatz, this sonata movement. Several works of Brahms actually have this FAE motive, if you're familiar with the second string quartet. F-A-E. So it is to be found here and there in the works of Brahms as a code for Brahms's loneliness as a single person, but yet his reluctance to marry. So it's just an interesting personal backdrop there. So Joseph Joachim, 21 years of age, already a celebrated violinist, receives this FAE sonata as a birthday present, and the scherzo, as we said, is a movement by Brahms. 19 years old, Brahms is a blazing talent, already exhibiting just remarkable musical maturity and creativity, and that Brahmsian spark that's just so fantastic. What would continue to mature with Brahms as he becomes an older and more experienced composer is his understanding of how the violin works acoustically and how it balances against a piano. Brahms, of course, not being a violinist himself. So, and at this point, I assume he didn't have nearly the input from, in writing the violin concerto, for instance, he had a great deal of input from Joachim, which he would not have in this case because he was writing this as a surprise birthday present. So in any case, the acoustical aspect of this sonata movement and the technical problems that it leads to are a substantial part of preparing to play this piece successfully. So right from the beginning, we have this horn-like kind of a fanfare, and I like to get ready to play this piece by just doing some strokes that let the bow really sink deeply into the string, so we don't start feeling as though the bow is coming, from above, dropping in on or being pushed around the top of the string, which can get a bit of a hissy sound. Instead, what we want is to feel like the bow is really engaging the heart of the string, deep down into the string. And then immediately the first technical difficulty we have is going from the G string, where you can really lay into the instrument, to the E string, which requires quite a different approach from the bow, or else we run the risk of forcing the sound or squeaking. And just unfortunately, crunches, that sort of thing on the E string, they really project in a space. So we want to just try to avoid that as much as we possibly can. I remember years back hearing a live performance of the Berlin Philharmonic in the third and fourth Brahms symphonies. And of course Berlin has such incredible musical drive and that expansive richness of sound. But one of the things that struck me is that as the Philharmonic violinists get higher up on the violin, even in the most dramatic passages, the climax of the first movement of the Fourth Symphony, where all that tragic dramatic action is coming to a head, the theme of the first movement comes back, and the first violins have and that passage is very easy to push the violin too hard, and it was very interesting to watch the Philharmonic violins have a visible gentleness in their stroke toward the string. Still a lot of feeling for as much fullness of sound as they can muster, but being very intentional not to push the violin beyond what it will give. And I think we can think similarly about the E string passages in the Sonatensatz. So, when we have something like how can we get the musical verve that we want without pushing the sound? So I think articulation is huge. Articulation at the beginnings of the notes, and you might want to re-articulate slightly in there. Also articulation at the end of the note, just so that we have a break in the sound with which to contextualize the beginning of the next sound. I think that's going to help the violin sound stand out against the piano. Once we've articulated the sound, we want to be sure that we don't feel like we have to push it or sustain it through, right? We want to just articulate and release. I like to think of the sound floating above the piano rather than trying to force its way through. So articulate and let it sing, let it float. And then within that floating, the next trick is then to try to achieve musical verve simply by crafting the line. And I think that's enough if we can just follow the general shape of the line. So we want to really feel where the harmonies are taking us. Cresting there, releasing a little bit. Sorry, I'm not a pianist by any stretch of the word, but with a little bit of release, driving toward the end of the phrase. And the trick then is to make sure that we still have that shape even as we release at the end of the notes. It's just something we have to be conscious of and not let the shaping of the phrase get in the way of our articulation, or our articulation destroy the shape of the phrase. And I think if we can put those together, the articulation, the floating, and however much shape we can do without forcing the sound, that will be enough to give it both the sound and the musical verve that will make it effective. Now the next phrase is just glorious. It has this sort of breathless, ecstatic, rhapsodic feeling. But unfortunately, it's in an area that just doesn't project well. Schumann loves this register of the violin as well, and it's so hard to make it project, to make it speak over the piano. So a couple of temptations. One is just outright to force the sound, which we want to avoid, of course. But sometimes, in order to help it to cut against the piano, it's tempting to really kick the beginning of every note. And the danger there is that can then undermine our phrasing. And I think if we want this to have the kind of that rhapsodic feeling to it, the shape of the phrase is incredibly important. And especially for me, if we hit that E flat, that really, for me, destroys the shape of the phrase, because I feel like where we want to go with this, we have the and for me that it really crests here and releases down to the E before moving on. So we want to just be sure that we're enunciating, but not kicking every note in such a way that undermines the phrase shape, or else I feel we lose the very thing that makes the phrase so wonderful in the first place. One last thing about this passage, the fingering is just really awkward. I've done various fingerings. What I've done most recently is actually starting on the G string, but with a fourth finger, so that when the violin first speaks, it has that extra presence of the G string. And then a quick glissando up to fourth position. Now, I like the glissando musically, but what that also does is it now sets me up in fourth position where I can just reach over to the G string, because otherwise that sixth is just a little tricky, and the D string doesn't speak quite as robustly as the G string. So 4-1, G string. Now on my fiddle, I have a kind of a high arch fiddle, and the strings I have on there are gut. And truth be told, the gut strings are getting a little on the old side. So all of those three things together means that this violin doesn't need and probably can't make use of quite as much sheer bow speed as maybe a Stradivar Guarneri model using synthetic strings. So I need a little, even more compact bow stroke. So I like to do a double down there. And even with a little light glissando, just to kind of get that sighing figure from the crest of the phrase. That's just me. But in any case, I find starting on the G string and going to fourth position to be, for me, the best way to get it to speak ideally. All right, so then we have the conclusion of the first scherzo section, and then we have this gorgeous, gorgeous trio that I feel like we're very often tempted to play squarely. Maybe it's because of the way Brahms has written the articulation. We have these dots under slurs. Remember that all that means, that's obviously not what he means. It just means a little bit of the slurs are gesture indications. He's just saying, don't just think note to note. Keep the lines long, and the dots aren't staccato. They just mean little bit of separation. So we want to be tempted we don't want to be tempted to play that too squarely. In fact, if you look at the piano part, we've got the violin has duplets, right? The violin has eighth notes, but the piano has triplets. And it has this wonderful kind of swooshing motion to it. And if we can feel our eighth notes as having freedom against those moving triplets, and in fact, I like to feel even the two beats within the bar. So that within each bar, within each 2/4 bar, there's a sense of whooshing and suspension, and whooshing and suspension. So that it's not, the beats aren't not square like that. Then within each beat, I also like to play the eighth notes a little bit unevenly, and maybe that's just me being old-fashioned, but because the eighths that fall on each beat are so expressive, they're dissonant, right? Dissonant, dissonant. And oftentimes when you hear players like Kreisler or Thibault, and they just get this wonderful feeling of freedom. That's one thing that they do very often. I mean, if you hear Thibault play, one particularly pronounced example is La Fille aux Cheveux de Lin. Now, I realize that's Debussy and not Brahms, but his 16th notes are almost like triplets, da da dum ba da dum da da da, and you'll find Kreisler doing this sort of thing all the time. So I think we can feel very much at liberty to give a little bit more weight to the first of those eighth notes, especially since they're dissonant and that much more expressive. So we want to just try to capture this sort of rhapsodic. And that same sort of rhapsodic feeling we also need to bring back at the end, where this gorgeous warm melody comes back, but now as a like too good to be true, homecoming sort of, I don't know, whatever concept you want to associate with it. And that melody at the end is written as dotted quarter notes. And because of that, I think just visually it can look square, and so we can often play. And we just want to, I think, really avoid that, because again, the piano is just playing long notes. The field is open, and we want to. I think it should have exactly the same feeling of the trio, except bigger and a little and broader, but that same freedom built in. And so big and broad, and then for the last chord, now he does something kind of unexpected here. You know, we would expect Brahms, who's very conscious of counterpoint and voice leading, at least I would expect a C major chord that puts a C as the lowest voice in the violin. Well, he doesn't. He just has a open G, which, I'm sorry, mine's going a little flat, but... And I think the reason for that is simply he's saying, you know, obviously there's a C in the piano, so I mean the root is covered there, but he just wants the violin to generate as much resonance as it possibly can. I mean, I think that's the only explanation for him voicing that chord as he does. So again, we want to think about not pushing, but just pulling the resonance out of the belly of the instrument. And be sure that you adjust the stroke from the G string to the E string as needed, because again, they need very different, even within a single chord, different bow strokes and different approaches to each side of the violin. And that's going to vary instrument to instrument. But whatever we need to do just to create the warmest, roundest, most overjoyed sound that we can. So anyway, that's just a little bit of scratching the surface, but I hope you have enjoyed engaging, playing, replaying this piece as much as I have, because it's just such a wonderful, wonderful staple of the literature. So thanks for watching.